Welcome to the Intermediate Data Visualization tutorial with Tableau. In this tutorial, we will go over several different chart types that perhaps you haven't had a chance to create or perhaps would like to play around with your data set. So the first that we'll explore is the pictograph, which is a chart with symbols. We'll also take a look at how to create a Gantt chart, a stacked timeline, as well as several maps, and how to upload custom shapes so that you can create a different kind of infographic and use those shapes in your charts in Tableau. So to get started, you'll want to download the first data set. You can either click the link in the slides, which are available online, or you can download, click the download link right below the video to grab this data set. So this is the data set that we've started to work with on the Ottoman governors of Arab provinces in the Ottoman Empire between the 16th and 19th centuries. In addition, there's also some data in there on the socio-political network in Constantine, Algeria, which is a smaller region in Algeria that was part of the Ottoman Empire. So as we get started, let's take a few minutes to examine this data set and see what's in there. So go ahead and load that into Tableau and click the data source button in the lower left corner if your data doesn't show up automatically. For example, if you're working in Tableau Public, it might go to your first worksheet. So go ahead and click that data source button and take a look at the data set. You'll notice that there are quite a few individuals in this data set, each with a unique ID code to help disentangle perhaps people with similar names. They all have unique identification numbers assigned to them. You'll also notice that we've got a column for the names in the sources. And sometimes we don't even know someone's name, we just know who they're related to. This happens a lot of times with women in our sources. So for example, this first individual in our data set is the sister-in-law of Boudiaf. We don't know her name, but we know she existed, and we know that she was Boudiaf's sister-in-law, and so that's how she's referred to in our data set. We also have some information about individuals' ethnicity as well as their gender, and so these are other variables that you'll see. You can scroll over to see the rest of the variables in the data set, and to just double check to make sure that Tableau is correctly interpreting the information that we have in here. For example, for start date, we'll want to make sure that there's a little calendar icon there and that Tableau is recognizing the start date as an actual date. Same thing with the end date. We've also got information on the individual governor's fates, as well as what city and modern country name of the region that they governed. So let's get started by creating a pictograph. So you'll want to click on the new worksheet icon, which in this case in my workbook is quite far over to the right because I have so many worksheets in this workbook already. Yours might be farther to the left. Wherever it is, find that new worksheet button and go ahead and click that. If you're just opening a new workbook, that will be sheet 1. You can see this is worksheet 15, which means I've built a lot of visualizations in this workbook already. So this is what we're aiming for. We're going to create a pictograph, which uses icons to represent individuals in the data set, and color, as well as some information here on the left to indicate different things about the individuals that are shown here. So the first thing that we're going to do is look for ID. Remember, I mentioned that each individual has a unique ID number. So we're going to take that variable of ID number and we're going to drag it over to detail and drop it. So that'll be the very first thing that we do. And we end up with a admittedly uninteresting visualization. Don't worry, we will make it more visually appealing in a few minutes. But what we see here is that each of these squares represent one individual in the data set. So as you can see on the left, this is what you will probably be seeing because you are most likely working in Tableau on a full screen. I have split my screen so that you can see both the slides and Tableau, but you can see here on the left what the view that you're probably seeing. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that we have some women in our data set, not very many, but we want to know a little bit more about the women that we do have. And so let's go ahead and take our variable for gender, find it in the left under tables, and let's drag that to color just to get a quick sense for how many men versus women we have in our data set. Now you'll notice here, and I'll minimize my data panel, that I'm still not seeing all of the data points because there's this little ellipsis here on the bottom. So I can change the size of the marks that appear in the visualization by going to the size card on marks, and it pulls up the slider so we can move the slider around. So I'm going to decrease the size a little bit so that I can actually see all of the individuals represented as these little squares. You can also go to your view option. Right now it's a drop down, and right now it says standard. So I'm going to actually tell it I want it to fit the entire view so I can use this whole space, especially because I have limited real estate since I have split my screen. So we can see that the majority of individuals in our data set are men. This is not terribly surprising, but we do see some women listed in our data set here. So the next step is to actually add the shapes. So I'm going to open up my data panel again. And I actually want to use the shape to indicate gender rather than color. So the first thing I need to do before I can bring gender, that variable, over onto the marks card again, is I need to indicate that rather than using automatic marks, I want to very explicitly use shapes. So go ahead and click that drop-down arrow where it says automatic and select shape. Now you can see that has converted our shape to these little rings or these little circles. Well, that's not quite what we're going for. So we want to distinguish people by gender and use shapes to indicate that. So I can either drag gender from under tables or from color. For consistency, I'll just grab it from tables because I know that that will always work. And you can see we now have the little icons that now represent our individuals. And here we also notice a new legend has appeared that tells us which icon is used to distinguish men and women. Now, if we want to choose a different icon, we simply click on shape. So find the shape card on marks, go ahead and click on that. And if it doesn't automatically populate with gender, click that drop-down arrow and note that there are a bunch of different palettes already built into Tableau. And at the end of this tutorial, I'll show you how to add your own shapes to Tableau's palettes. And notice that there's one specifically for gender. So if we go ahead and click that, we can see the gender palette. And you can, like I said, you can add your own icons in here and use those instead. So for example, this little icon down here, just sort of an ambiguous person. It could be male, female, could identify in many different ways. So I've added a new icon to this palette. For this data set, because the individuals living at this time between the 16th and 19th century in Arab provinces in the Ottoman Empire would have identified as either a man or as a woman. So in this case, the binary between men and women is fairly accurate, at least in terms of how we understand these individuals would have identified themselves in the past. So for the male icon, I'll just make sure that it's an icon that looks a little more like a little more masculine. And then for the woman, make sure that we choose an icon that might indicate femininity. And you can then click Assign Palette or Apply, and then finally, OK. And these shapes are fairly small, even when I minimize my data pane. So again, you can go back to your size slider. So click on that size button and just increase the size of the icons to make them a little easier to see. And because I have selected entire view for my view options from the dropdown in the upper right corner, that will fill the whole space so I can take advantage of the workspace that I've got here. So I can see all of our individuals. Now, the next thing I mentioned as I introduced our data set is that not every individual in our data set is explicitly named in the sources. So if we look at our data panel and find the variable that indicates how an individual was identified, that variable name is simply named. You know, our individuals named explicitly in the sources. And there are three options in terms of how that question was answered for this data set. So many individuals were explicitly named in the source materials. Then there were people like the sister-in-law of Bu Diaf who were referenced in the sources, but not named. And so that's the second option. And then thirdly, we also identified people through other relationships that already existed in the data set. The most common way that we did this was by noticing a father-son relationship and reasonably deducing that a woman had to be involved in bringing that son into the world. And the most likely relationship that that woman would have had to the father would have been as that man's wife. And so we added connections between this woman that we identified through inferential reasoning to her, most likely her husband, and then to her son. So if we want to indicate that information in this pictograph, we can drag named to color because we're already using the shape to indicate gender. So now we can use color to indicate a different variable. So if we drag named to color, I'm going to minimize my data pane so you can see this in a larger format. Now we've been able to indicate whether an individual has been identified through inference or through reference, or if they're explicitly named in the source materials. Now you'll notice that the colors are slightly different in the chart on the right in Tableau from the chart that is in the slide presentation. And that's because I have changed the color options in this color palette to be able to distinguish between this sort of burnt orange color and this kind of bright orange. They look so similar in this chart that I decided to edit the colors. So to do that, you can simply click the color card on marks and edit colors when that pop-up shows up. And then simply select the variable that you want to change in terms of color. So let's say I wanted inference to be this light gray. Now that light gray looks kind of similar to the blue, especially when we're dealing with small icons, which is why I went with this light orange. And same thing here. You can just select the variable you want and change the color. The other thing I want to point out before I navigate away from this screen is that we're using a colorblind, accessible, and friendly palette that is natively built into Tableau, which is fantastic. So I highly recommend either using the colorblind palette that is in Tableau or selecting a palette and then doing some accessibility testing. There are free apps that you can download for either PC or Mac that will allow you to see, especially if you have normal color vision, you can see what those colors look like with variations of color blindness. Again, the most common variation is green, red. They become kind of shades of gray or so muted that it's very difficult to tell the differences between red and green. There are other variations, which is why it's good to do some testing. So go ahead and click apply and then OK, and that will set your colors for you. Now, the last step that we'll take with this chart is to drill down a little bit and explore the question of the women in the sources. How were they identified? So over here on your gender your shape legend, you can select woman, and you'll get some options that come up. Oops. If you double click, apparently your shape options will appear. So if you hover over it, you can either exclude this variable or you can keep only. So we want to keep just the women from the data set in our chart. So I'll go ahead and increase the size again so you can see this a little more clearly. Now it's kind of a nice visualization, but it's still difficult to tell, to be able to really compare how many named versus referenced versus women identified through inference do we have in our data set. So the last step here is to grab that variable called named and drag that over to rows. And when you drop that, that's what will create these 3 separate bars, basically, that will showcase how many individuals we have in each of these categories. If you are working in Tableau desktop, you can drag these legends around as I just did. So I just took them from the side and moved them to the bottom. If you're working in Tableau public, you can't change where that legend appears, but in desktop you can. So that allows me to show you this visualization in a little bit larger format so you can see that more clearly. So now we can see the distinct differences between women identified through inferential reasoning, women who were explicitly named in the sources, and those who were referenced but not named. So this is our largest category. You see we've got the most women little figures in this category here. Now, the last thing that we can do if we are going to share an interactive visualization is we can add, here we go, the variable name and sources to our tooltip, and that will tell us who each of these women were as we mouse over their little icon. So for example, this first woman in the inference category was the wife of Mohammed El-Kabir. We don't know her name, but we know she existed, that she was Mohammed El-Kabir's wife and the mother of Mohammed El-Kabir's son, Omar. So finally, as I repeated in our first tutorial, don't forget to name your chart and to provide a worksheet name in the bottom tab. So you can double click or right click on where it says sheet 15 on my screen. It might say worksheet 1 for you. Go ahead and either double click or right click. That will allow you to edit that information. So we're going to call this women by identification category. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and provide a little reminder in that tab so I remember what this chart is when I'm trying to find different things in this workbook. So the next chart type that we'll create is a Gantt chart. So that will be in the next tutorial. Please join me there. Thank you.